morning, Warsaw. Today is Tuesday, 22nd August. It will be fine, but cloudy in the evening with highs of 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 5:46 a.m. and sunset at 8:03 p.m. We are on the 22nd day of the Warsaw Uprising, and Stalin is still playing games and not allowing the Allies access to Soviet-controlled airstrips. Apart from Stalin not helping the Poles, what else is happening during the uprising?
Thanks for that, Philip. Yes, the Stalin still isn't helping the Poles, and we're on, day 22. So I think that's going to go on for a little while. We're starting with what's happening on the ground, and Roger, you're going to tell us more.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest, sort of almost a set-piece clash of the Warsaw Rising. I mean, much of this is sort of, as you can imagine, is urban guerrilla warfare and sort of rather smaller engagements. But this is a much larger engagement. It's actually a battle for the Gdansk Railway station up in the north of the city. And this was an important target for the insurgents, and particularly for those coming from the outside. So there were sort of insurgent units that were up in Campinos Forest, up to the northwest of Warsaw still. And they were given the instruction, as you'll remember, a couple of days previously, to sort of try and break into the city to assist with the fight in the city itself. And this is the result of that to a large extent. So a large force of insurgents comes from that sort of from Campinos and from the further out northwestern suburbs to try and break into the city, defeat the Germans at the Gdansk Railway station. And that takes place over the day of the 20th and the night of the 20th to the 21st. They fail, sadly, and at huge cost. There's about 400 dead and wounded, 400 casualties on the side of the insurgents, and it's one of the bloodiest sort of single engagements of the whole of the uprising. So sadly unsuccessful.
And just reminding you, this is the second assault. I spoke about the first assault a couple of days earlier, where 100 people were killed in the attack on the Gdansk Railway station. This is the second one, and this has a much greater loss of life.
Yeah, absolutely. Alina, they're still fighting for the Little Pasta building. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, this is actually one of my definitely one of my favourite actions that happened during the uprising. Not as dramatic as what happened during the capture of the big pasta building, but this one takes place on the night of the 21st and 22nd of August. It begins at 2:45 a.m. And you've got to remember, for those who haven't listened about this, the Germans are holding strong within the Little Pasta building. It's a smaller version of the telecommunications building, and the insurgents have been surrounding it and been preventing any German units from coming to relieve whoever's inside. Now, the insurgents cut the telephone wires on the roofs of the building, so the building is completely vulnerable. Then at 4:15 a.m, the sappers detonate explosives on the west side of the building. So the hole that they created in the corner of the roof was just too small, and the soldiers literally had to force their way through it one by one. And the first one to burst into the building was a second lieutenant. He was immediately seriously wounded, and 2 soldiers who accompanied him were also killed on the spot. The Germans managed to cover the breach with a machine gun, and it was a successful way of blocking the entrance. At the same time this is happening, another unit is attacking on the first floor level, trying to take advantage of the breach in the Germans, who are concentrating on the explosion in the roof. However, before the insurgents were able to get in, the Germans showered them grenade, which more or less ended in failure. But the Poles are not going to give up. They've got sappers who are hiding behind the walls, ready to smoke the Germans out of the long corridor by using, again, same as the other one, flamethrowers. These weapons have a limited range of only about 50 metres, and of course, the same problem again, the fires went out really quickly. When the Germans found out that the flamethrowers were not as effective, they immediately opened fire at the insurgents, and the insurgents responded with their own gunfire and Molotov cocktails. Eventually, the assault of this part of the building also ends in failure, so far we've got a lot of failures, but again, the insurgents are just not going to let go. They set fire to the western back premises of the building, which they did by using flamethrowers and bottles with petrol. Another failure, that the assault from the front of the building just didn't happen because the flanking attacks resulted. It was just a mess. The insurgents decided to put up a megaphone and made an appeal to the Germans, explaining that any further resistance is pointless, and they tried to coax them to surrender. But their answer was a burst of gunfire. At around 9 a.m, there was an order to, again, bring in a motor pump into action like they did in the other building. But the Germans, they shot through the motor pump's nozzle, and the soldier who was operating the equipment was wounded in the head. And the second that the insurgents repaired it, it was again damaged by the Germans. So finally, they managed to fix the motor pump once again, and they were able to cover the walls of the main building with flammable liquid. So being under constant fire, the insurgents nevertheless were able to throw in some grenades, some Molotov cocktails from across the street, and of course setting it alight. So the building bursts into flames, and the fire starts to spread very quickly to the upper floors of the building. However, it's not long before another bullet damages the pump's nozzle, and the machine is out of order, and the fire goes out. But in spite of this, the insurgents couldn't make the Germans surrender, and the Germans hung out a yellow flag symbolising utmost danger to the rest of the units, and spread the cloth with a swastika on the roof of the building. This was noticed by an enemy plane, which began to circle over the burning building. This continued up until about 6 p.m, when the German forces made another attempt at liberating their crew in the Little Pasta. So squads of police and a Ukrainian company supported by 2 tanks attacked, but the insurgents resisted the attack. They managed to push off the Germans. The German infantry was assisted by a panzer tank, and the insurgents then shot at the tank by using a Piat, and it put the tank out of action. The German infantry just couldn't break through with the constant grenade attacks of insurgents, and they were forced to withdraw from the area. As a result of this, the Germans suffered heavy losses, and on the evening of the 22nd of August, the German commander of the Little Pasta building entered into negotiations with the insurgents. He informed the insurgents that the German soldiers would stop fighting on one condition, that they were free to leave the building and depart the main station. Unfortunately, the insurgents definitely said no. They would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender, and the negotiations were broken off. There was a scheduled attack on the following day, and we will learn a little bit more about that tomorrow.
I find this history of the warfare, the individual engagements, fascinating. But I have to say it's not my strength as a historian. I'm a bit more of a social historian biographer. And what fascinates me is, against this backdrop of appalling loss of life, building to building fighting, sometimes room to room fighting, that during the Warsaw Uprising, in fact, throughout the whole occupation, the Polish people have got various other missions going. They've created an entire underground state, a system that has not just a fighting force, but an educational force. There's an underground university, there are underground law courts. All of this is still going on. One of the other things they have is a ministry to preserve cultural assets. They know that part of their enemy's mission is to destroy the history, the culture and the traditions of the Polish people. They wanted to take the land and repopulate it. And so they have a mission to preserve the Polish culture. And this started earlier on during the occupation. It's a bit like that not particularly good, I've got to say, film, The Monuments Men, where a couple of Americans come in and try to save some of the Parisian cultural artifacts. Well, the Poles are also doing this to protect their own artifacts. And that includes very early on in the war, they got a lot of the national treasures out of the country. But by 1944, by the uprising, this is a process that's still ongoing. So you have various professors of architecture and arts and archaeology during the occupation who are preparing instructions on conservation of artifacts. They are secretly training art conservators. And then during the uprising itself, they are continuing to serve. They're risking their lives to protect thousands of priceless documents. That might be manuscripts, maps. Some of them are artworks as well. And a lot of these, they're removed from the National Museum because there are thousands and thousands. I mean, some of the most prestigious have been already removed from the country, but there are millions of artworks. And so now they're looking at the lower tiers of those because they're terrified. They know the Nazis are either going to remove these and put them in their own collections, or they're just going to destroy them as they destroy the city.
So this is the sort of genocidal intent of the Germans being writ large, it's to destroy Polish culture, isn't it? So anything that can be sort of passed off as broadly Germanic, as you say, will disappear into German collections. But anything that's resolutely Polish is fit for nothing but destruction.
That's right. Well, a few things were kept. I mean, the Nazis, we know they were going to have various museums. One would have been for, a few Jewish artifacts, they were just saving a very, very few as examples. And they might have saved a few of these, but essentially Poland has this incredible history going back centuries, doesn't it, of being invaded, occupied and annexed into different empires. And during that time, they have maintained their cultural heritage. And part of that is through word of mouth, through song, through tradition and storytelling passed down through generations. But it's also, they have this incredible cultural assets as well. And that is now Germany says, right, enough. They want to wipe that off the map. They want to claim that this was always historic land that they should have had ownership of, and they want to implant it with their own cultural. You see this is still policy that's ongoing. Yeah, we see this in conflicts today. And so the Poles are determined. So even while there is street fighting going on, they've got these losses, they've also got teams of people going out to try and protect some of the most important cultural assets in Warsaw. And what does that look like on the ground? Well, again, Zoe comes across this. About this time during the uprising, she is forced back because these different regions of Warsaw, of course, being occupied by the Nazis, and then the partisans are pushing back, and it's constantly changing between different streets in different areas. They're being pushed out of the old town at the moment. And Zoe has to move her headquarters of supply. So she has a team. They move down into a rather posh, what was quite an upmarket area of Warsaw, near the Botanical Gardens, as was. And suddenly she's putting their headquarters into this house, absolutely beautiful apartment building. It's still got, glass-fronted vitrines full of wine glasses that are etched or gilt-surrounded crockery, absolutely beautiful. I think she's quite stunned. She's kind of forgotten that life can look like this. It's like a little microcosm that just hasn't been hit yet by either, bombed or street fighting. So she sets up their headquarters in there. And then the next day, there's a knock on the door, which is, in a war zone. So she opens the door. It's all a bit surreal, really. And there's this elderly art conservator who's been sent to inspect the artworks in the houses in this region of Warsaw. This is going on during the battle. And he comes in and he makes an inventory. He lists all of the paintings. She sees him selecting a few of them, and he gives her a receipt and he takes them down. She thinks they can be stored in the cellar, but he actually takes them out to a deeper cellar of a nearby library building. And so the regional artifacts are kept there. Now, we don't know whether those artifacts were preserved and survived in that cellar, because so much of Warsaw was later completely destroyed with these huge bombs going all through, into the underground. But this is the work that is ongoing. It's extraordinary, really, that in the height of battle, this concern is very valid and they are undertaking this preservation work. They've got to say, actually, when he left, Zoe was like, isn't this wonderful, amazing? We're still humans. This is still part of us. This is our cultural heritage is important to us and being preserved. And then she notices that he's stolen their last jar of tomatoes. But she said, we understood that because we were all desperate. He's just a man as well, So just wanted to give that idea of the levels of what this fighting means.
Yeah, that's very good, Claire. There's one point that just to bring in from the earlier history of the occupation that I think is relevant here, is that the Germans' intention with Warsaw, you talked about this, the idea of sort of downgrading Warsaw and writing off that sort of Polish history. Warsaw itself was essentially slated to be removed from the map. So it was, from 1940 there was a plan under the German occupation. There was a plan then put forward by a German civil planner whose name was Pabst. And it's called the Pabst Plan, and it was to reduce Warsaw in significance essentially to a provincial town. So it would go from, become 1/10 of the size that it was in 1939. No longer be the capital, obviously. It would be a provincial town, with German settlers, presumably with Polish servants, and that was it. That was how they would. The idea of Warsaw being the Polish capital would be completely consigned to history. Right, so that it's very symbolic of everything that you're saying. This is a grand plan. This isn't just something on the hoof been dreamt up during the heat of the Warsaw Rising. This is part of a grand, thought out, coherent plan to reduce, Poland to nothing, and particularly Warsaw to merely regional significance.
I just want to add a couple of things in here too. So, for example, the reason that the archives Akt Nowych has whatever archives they have left is because they're predominantly donations that were given to them from people or pieces that were managed to be smuggled out of Warsaw. The other thing is, and this is a larger statistic rather than just Warsaw specifically, but there are still 666,000 pieces of artwork that are still yet to be recovered. They have never come back. 600 have been brought back to Poland over the past 70 years, but still 66,000 are lost. It was not long ago that I think it was Sotheby's or Christie's, one of those professional auction places, actually auctioned off a sword that was Polish from, I can't remember which century it was, maybe the 12th or the 10th century, and it was stolen from Poland during the occupation. And so many of these pieces of artwork and culture and history and heritage have been looted, and we're still waiting to get them back. Many of them are in private homes, or people just don't want to give them back, or they don't even know that they were looted and stolen during the occupation and during the Warsaw Uprising.
So we're talking about the views of the Germans and the Russians previously on Warsaw. What is going on with the international negotiations between those allies and enemies? What's going on between Russia and Britain at the moment?
Yeah, that rift between the Grand Alliance over Warsaw has not mended itself. It doesn't mend itself for a long time, if at all. Stalin basically is ready to reply. He replies to the joint letter that's been sent by Churchill and Roosevelt on the 20th, and by the 22nd he replies, and absolutely unrepentant. He says that, quote, sooner or later the truth about the handful of criminals who initiated the Warsaw Brawl in order to capture it will become known to everyone. So this is what he's still unrepentant. He's saying this is a criminal act. This is the adventurers and bandits on the ground. It's not something that he's willing to support. And the sort of cynicism of this position.
I was going to jump in and say, because we know that Radio Moscow was broadcasting just before the uprising, saying now is the time to seize arms, now is the time to rise up. And if you don't rise up, Poles, we will take it that you're virtually collaborating with the Germans.
Completely. Yeah. The cynicism is astonishing, really. I mean, it's no great surprise. Look, Kremlin in cynical politics, shocker. This is kind of this is their stock in trade. But the cynicism of what comes after it in Stalin's message is really interesting, because he talks about, at the end of it, he says there can be no doubt that the Red Army will spare no effort to defeat the Germans near Warsaw and liberate Warsaw for the Poles. This will be the best and real help for Polish anti-fascists. So, of course, bear in mind, he's saying that the Red Army will spare no effort to liberate Warsaw. Well, it's sitting on the other side of the Vistula and doing very, very little to help the Poles. The key thing is that phrase where he says that the Red Army will liberate Warsaw. Problem for him, from his perspective and from the Soviet perspective, was that the Home Army and the Polish underground was trying to liberate Warsaw for themselves, not allow themselves to be liberated simply by the Red Army. So he realizes, you can see by reading between the lines of that statement, that he realized exactly what's going on strategically.
Well, that's the end of episode 22. Thank you so much for joining us. And remember, I'm going to reiterate this many times, do go and give us a 5-star review on your favourite listening platform. Also, if you do really like us, send over your friends, get them to listen to it a little bit more, especially those who don't know much about the uprising and should learn a little bit more. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks so much, everyone.